second tour of America, and I'm sure you're probably sick of it by now, but exactly what does the name Psychedelic Furs mean to you? What does it signify, and how does it relate to what you're trying to do musically?
We were influenced by the music in the 60s a little bit. There was an aura of bands being more adventurous around that time. Instead of during the punk time when we started out, everybody's playing at 100 miles an hour and listing everything they hate and being totally negative about everything. And I just figured that was a bit pathetic, besides the fact that all the bands were calling themselves heavy-sounding names, which was a bit stupid as well. It was just too negative. And we didn't want to get sucked into that whole scene.
In a previous interview, you mentioned that when the band first started, that during the so-called punk explosion of '77, and as you just mentioned, you wanted to be different than punk. What specifically were the differences that you had with that scene as far as the so-called punk ideology goes?
They were negative. They were listing down things they hated. There was no sort of positive attitude. There was no adventure in the invention and the invention of the music. No, there was no invention about, making anything different. There was the punk ideology was that you were supposed to be an individual, but you dressed all the same, and there was no individuality in that movement, besides the people who founded it, who I still have a bit of respect for.
The first song we'll be listening to tonight is, appropriately enough, the group's first single, We Love You.
Yes, that is a list partly of sarcasm. I've just been saying about things being negative, and now I'm talking about sarcasm. But it was our first single in Europe, which didn't do very well, and but it's a great song. I enjoy it. Yeah, people weren't really ready in England for that song at the time we made it, and they are now though. They're lapping it up.
In a recent magazine article, you were quoted as saying that the Sex Pistols were important not for their sound, but because they broke down barriers in the business that allowed bands, which ironically enough in some cases may have been totally different, to become more adventurous. What specifically were some of those barriers?
There's a lot of them, in England especially. The Sex Pistols came along at a time when everybody felt they needed something different. They looked different, they acted differently, their music was different. What was sad about what eventually happened to it was, though that band were different, what I've just been saying about punk rock happened, in that everybody thought they had to follow that line, and they didn't take advantage of the fact that they'd broken down some walls and now you can do anything. They just said, well, they've broken down the walls, we want to follow them behind it and do exactly the same, which was a bit, stupid.
Talking a little bit now of the early stages of the group, since the nucleus of the group were basically non-musicians in the beginning, do you think it allowed the group more freedom to explore and experiment with different musical ideas than if you were all, let's say, trained musically from childhood?
Yeah. We had all the freedom in the world. I mean, when you're trained, or if you learn to play guitar, you always have your heroes, and when you learn to play guitar, you probably want to play like them. And the advantage of starting a group and not being able to play is that you have no real hero. I mean, you may have heroes, but when you put in a group situation, you can't fulfill them, if you like, because you're with 5 other guys. Any one of our band will be with 5 other guys who's, they're just not into the same stuff, so you can't do that. You just have to say, well, these guys don't want that. We want you to try and sound like this, do that, or work this out. And it's, your horizons are a bit broader, I think, probably.
And getting to the next song of our special this evening, we'll be listening to probably one of Psychedelic Fur's more provocative numbers, Imitation of Christ.
Yeah, it was inspired by, there's a Thomas Kempis book called Imitation of Christ, and there's also an Andy Warhol movie called Imitation of Christ, which sparked off the idea. It's just about walls being made out of religion, instead of opening things up and being as generous as they purport. It's just about how they're wolves instead.
Just heard Imitation of Christ off the first Psychedelic Furs album. And just joining us is Duncan Kilburn, the saxophone and keyboard player for the band. And when one looks at the differences between the American and British charts, it seems that a group with a non-mainstream sound has a better chance of gaining some success and recognition in England as opposed to America. What do you think accounts for this difference?
That's a tricky question, I think. It's obvious that as far as a band is concerned, everything's easier in England because it's so much smaller, and it's so much easier to reach a large percentage market, if you like. In other words, like because there are so many places so much smaller, it's easier to get to more people. That's probably got most to do with it, I think. On the other hand, I sort of disagree in some ways. I mean, the competition is stronger in London and in England in general for the sort of thing that we're doing. And you do see bands like the Human League and Echo and the Bunnymen, I mean, who have considerable chart success, really. So, I mean, they're doing very well. Whereas over here, I mean, it seems like an impossible task. I mean, you can tour all year and make no impression at all. And we've been very fortunate this time round. I mean, we had that experience last year, but this tour, we seem to have picked up far quicker from the outset, which is better than we aimed for. It's going very well.
This is referring back to something Richard mentioned in an interview as far as the British music papers having just a lot of control over what happens and what gets successful or not over in England. And they're sometimes accused of either dictating or inventing trends like the so-called psychedelic revival of last year that Psychedelic Furs were lumped in. How does this affect British groups in general and the Psychedelic Furs in particular?
Well, I don't know if Rich has made the point, but because of the lack of radio stations in England, in Britain in general, the music press tend to have far more domination over what goes on. Just how important they are is impossible to gauge. I think it's one of those total sort of impossible equations. But I mean, I think they do have some effect. I mean, there's no doubt that a lot of people do read those papers, and a lot of people listen to what's said. I mean, we've gone from being their sort of blue-eyed boys to being, their absolute whipping boys. Really. I mean, we've had a lot of trouble this year with them. So, I mean, as far as we're concerned, they're not our favourite organisations at the moment. I don't know, everybody in England refers to them as the comics, and I think that just about sums them up, really. Whereas, I mean, we do find far more intelligent writing over here. Really. The features and everything, I mean, tend to bother a lot more about the important aspects of the music. I mean, to talk about psychedelic revival and all that sort of stuff, I mean, what they seem to like to do is to create things themselves, and that's right across the board. They like to create bands. If they pick up on a band and that nobody else knows about, irrespective of how good the band is, if they're the first people on the case, then they'll have a lot of good things to say about their band. As soon as that band gets discovered or accepted by a lot of other people buy the records, or they're picked up by a record company, they like to turn it all around and say, right, we're no longer into this. They're last week's news sort of thing. It's all very unfortunate.
The next song we'll be listening to in our special is also from the first album, and it's called Sister Europe.
It was the first single. Actually, no, it's the second single off the first album, but the first single being We Love You, which came out about 2 months before the album. But this was, like, if you like, the album single. And I don't know, I think we're quite proud of it. It seems to be a major favourite.
A midnight thunderstorm. A shot rang out in the darkness. It was murder. This way, Inspector Holmes, in this room, here.
Thank you. Come along, Watson.
Good heavens, Holmes, a dead body.
Precisely, Watson, and he was listening to music when he died.
Well, how do you figure that, old boy?
Elementary, my dear Watson. He has on a pair of headphones, and the cord is plugged into that FM radio over there.
I wonder what he was listening to.
The radio is tuned to 89.7, my good doctor, which happens to be WCUT-FM.
Why WCVT, Holmes?
Obviously, the deceased knew good radio when he heard it.
Eh?
Of course, Watson. WCVT-FM offers an extraordinary variety of listening pleasure. Everything from classical music to informative educational programming. WCVT offers a great deal to the listener, Watson, and the deceased obviously was aware of this.
Marvelous, Holmes. Simply marvelous. Just incredible.
Yes, Watson, I am rather something.
Not you, Holmes. WCVT-FM 89.7. Stereo, Holmes.
Yes, Watson. Stereo.
In Towson.
In Towson.
Each Sunday at 9 p.m., WCVT offers something special, something unique. The Unique is the music program that offers exclusive interviews, informative biographies, rare album features, and more. Listen to The Unique. You just might make a habit of it. Sunday nights at 9 o'clock on WCVT-FM.
Back once again with Duncan Kilburn and Richard Butler of the Psychedelic Furs. In the early days of the group, the lyrics, from what I understand, were always improvised. Richard, do you still come up with lyrics exclusively through improvising, or have you developed other ways of coming up with words?
No, it's weird. I mean, we never wanted an album to sort of freeze things, but it tends to happen. You know, like at one point we said, after we'd made the first album, we said, yeah, we're going to ignore what people want, and we're just going to do, you know, what they come down to see. And I'd be improvising, and there'd be people mouthing the lyrics at the front of the stage, and they're getting it totally wrong, and they'd go home pretty pissed off. So we don't improvise quite so much nowadays. I mean, the improvisation comes when the band make up a tune, and we'll be in the studio, and I improvise when I'm making them up, and then formulate them into something a bit more concrete. But the same level of improvisation, or that even, it doesn't happen anymore. I mean, we used to play 15-minute songs and use vacuum cleaners on stage and things like that, which we don't anymore.
It all sounds very exciting, doesn't it? I mean, people.
It wasn't. It was. It was terrible.
People are wishing they'd seen it.
I mean, can you imagine playing a Hoover under a hail of bottles around the punk era? You know, it was no fun at all.
Since the beginning of the Psychedelic Furs, is there any particular scheme or pattern to the lyrics that's come out of your original improvising?
How can you get a scheme or a pattern out of improvising? It seems like a
Contradiction.
A contradiction in terms. Yeah.
Well, something that's developed since that point up to now, for example.
Oh yeah. I just write about things I feel about.
How does the band go about working the arrangements around the basic structure of the song once you first start working on something?
Well, it takes a long time for a start, or the way we've been working up till now. We're experimenting with the idea of changing our writing sort of patterns and the way we put songs together for the third album. We're going to see how it works. But the way we've worked on the last two is simply by going into a room, right, for about 3 months or 2 months.
Another point I would make is that the arranging is the making up of the song, in that there's not one person who writes a song and then goes into the studio and says, hey, this is the song. When songs get written, there are half a dozen of us there, so all the arrangements get done because everybody has a part to do, and they work those parts in there, so it's pretty much, the arrangement is pretty much the writing of the song.
It seems that throughout the history of rock, whenever a band has a good debut album, a lot of times the second one isn't as strong, yet I certainly don't think that's the case with the Psychedelic Furs. However, was there any pressure on you when you went in to record this, the album Talk, to try and live up to the standards of the first album?
No, I mean, in England we took a year over doing it. Over here the first album was released 6 months later than it was in England, so it seems like a good time. The timing is better in America. In England we took a year over it. Nobody puts pressure on us. We don't like being pressured, you know. So there was no pressure really.
What were some of the differences in the way the band approached the second album as opposed to the first?
Well, I think a band's first album, I mean, it's something which in our case anyway, and I think it's fairly common, it's something you've been working on for a number of years. I mean, what the record company sees before they sign you is that's what they envisage the first album to be, and that's generally the case, and it was in our case as well. But as Richard said, because the distance between the two albums was like a year, which is longer than we expected, because of the delay in picking up the album in America, we had to come and tour here, sort of much later in the year than we expected. We had a lot more time to work on it. So, I mean, we've been fortunate in some ways that there hasn't been external pressure for us to produce material. It's evolved quite naturally over a fairly long period of time.
If anybody starts pressuring us, we just say, forget it, we're going to go home. Yeah, on the subject of If You Like a Train, in England a lot of people have thought it to be somehow connected with sexuality or being sexist songs. You must have heard of the term pulling a train, whereas in fact it's not. It's just saying that we don't want to change anything because there have been so many political bands around, and political songs don't change a thing. All it's saying is, you know, if you're living an imaginative type life, we're into you. I mean, we're into pretty much everything.
It's well known that trains are imaginative vehicles.
Lots of people who travel on trains have imaginations, you know, and this is what it's about, really.
This is a song called Murder on the Orient Express, or Into You Like a Train.
The next thing I want to bring up is your producer, Steve Lillywhite. It's hard to come across anyone who's been involved with as many quality bands as he has over the past couple of years. Where do you think his talent lies as far as producing?
He knows how to twiddle knobs around on the mixing desk, and well, for us anyway, I mean, the main reason we need a producer is because we've all got ideas how we want it done ourselves, and we need somebody between us and the desk, or else it'd just be like a riot in front of the desk, a riot of six.
I think that's the major point. Is that he's a great diplomat and a really good arbiter, you know, and that's really important for a band like us, as Richard said. Also, he's a great arranger as well. And we were talking about arrangements earlier on. Well, I mean, there's no doubt that as a producer, he contributed to the arrangement as well. And also, I mean, as far as coming up with additional melodies to the material we had, he's very, very good at that.
He's got a head full of melodies, Steve.
Yeah.
Really is.
And he spent a lot of time in pre-production with us as well. I mean, actually working with the band while we were rehearsing. We did shows, a few shows. We played the Marquee 2 nights at the Marquee before we went in to actually do the album. And he spent a lot of time with us, like going over the material, making sure he understood what we were trying to do. And that sort of makes him a great producer, I think, and that's exactly what he is. Yeah.
He takes care, you know. I mean, this is another point I've made before. You get some producers who have their own particular sound. You know, you can recognise, for instance, I don't mean to knock the guy, but Martin Hannett in England, if he produces a song by any band, you know it's Martin Hannett. You don't know who the band are, but you know it's Martin Hannett, and it's like John Wayne in a movie. When John Wayne's in a movie, he doesn't act. You know, it's always John Wayne being John Wayne, dressed in a cowboy outfit, dressed as, God knows, Godzilla or whatever. He's always John Wayne, whereas Steve Lillywhite takes time out to think of what the band actually want and concentrates on that. He's like a chameleon, if you like.
Since you mentioned Martin Hannett, how does he differ from Steve Lillywhite in the way he works in the studio?
He's very, very different. He's like, he is Martin Martian Hannett. He's on a different planet, really. And he's great. His forte is getting really weird sounds. I mean, he made a tape loop for us when we were doing soap commercial that was about 14 feet long. You know, it went round a stand that a speaker was on and right into the tape room, which was right over the desk. And it might not have been soap commercial, but he made it so you could play the desk and you could get different notes out of the desk by pushing these different buttons, which is, I mean, he's great. He's like a real whiz kid electronically. But like I say, I mean, for us, anyway, the problem is that he makes things sound the same.
The next song we'll be getting to off of Talk, Talk, Talk is called Pretty in Pink.
Pretty in Pink. Yes, indeed it is. It's Pretty in Pink. Let me think about Pretty in Pink. It's our single in the UK of this particular album, and it will be our US single as well. And it looks like, I mean, in England particularly, it's done very well for us. it's steaming up the charts, and it looks like we're going to have to take a short break from to go back and do just a bit of work on it over there. But we're really pleased with it, and it's going to be our debut US single. It looks like we haven't actually had anything out as yet on 7-inch.
My name is Rod Misey. I've been your host. Thank you for listening, and good night.